For many years, we have been told a simple story about depression and anxiety. The story says that if you are struggling, the main problem is somewhere inside you, in your brain chemistry, your personality, your weakness, or your inability to cope. It is a story that can sound comforting at first, because it suggests that suffering has a neat explanation and perhaps a neat solution. But for many people, that explanation has never felt complete. It leaves too much out. It does not explain why so many more people across modern society seem overwhelmed, exhausted, lonely, and emotionally fragile than before. It does not explain why people who seem outwardly successful still feel empty. And it does not explain why, even when some treatments bring relief, the deeper distress often remains. So perhaps the question is not only, what is wrong with this person? Perhaps we should also ask, what has happened in the way we live? What if emotional pain is not simply a private defect, but also a response to disconnection, pressure, and unmet human needs? That possibility changes everything, because it asks us not only to treat symptoms, but to examine the world that keeps producing them. To begin with, we should be careful not to swing from one extreme to another. Biology matters. Genes matter. The body matters. Anyone who talks honestly about depression and anxiety must admit that these experiences are real, serious, and often physically overwhelming. They are not invented, exaggerated, or simply chosen. Some people are more vulnerable than others. Some benefit greatly from medication or clinical treatment, and that should never be dismissed. But acknowledging biology should not mean reducing the whole human experience to biology. A person is not only a nervous system. A person also lives in relationships, routines, institutions, and values. We all know this instinctively in other parts of life. If a child is distressed, we ask what happened. If a worker is burning out, we ask about pressure and conditions. If someone is grieving, isolated, frightened, or trapped, we do not usually assume the problem is merely a defective brain. Yet when it comes to depression and anxiety, modern culture often narrows the lens too quickly. We end up treating deeply meaningful suffering as if it were just a technical fault. And once we do that, we stop listening carefully to what pain may be trying to tell us about the life surrounding it. One of the clearest messages emotional pain may be sending concerns loneliness. Human beings are social creatures in a profound sense, not in a decorative one. Connection is not a luxury added on top of life once the serious needs are met. It is one of the serious needs. We need affection, recognition, mutual dependence, and the steady knowledge that we matter to other people. Yet many of us live in conditions that weaken precisely those bonds. We move frequently, work long hours, communicate through screens, and inhabit communities where people may live side by side without really knowing each other. We are connected in a technical sense, yet often disconnected in an emotional one. The result is a strange contradiction. We can receive messages all day and still feel that no one truly sees us. This kind of loneliness is not only sadness. It can become a full atmosphere in which life feels thin and unreal. And when people are lonely for long enough, it should not surprise us that anxiety grows and hope shrinks. A lonely person is carrying more than silence. They are carrying the absence of reassurance, the absence of shared meaning, and the absence of that basic human feeling that someone would notice if they disappeared. Another source of distress lies in the way many people work. A large number of us spend most of our waking hours doing tasks we did not choose, under pressures we do not control, for goals we did not define. Of course, work has always involved necessity. Few societies have ever offered perfect freedom. But there's an important difference between hard work and powerless work. When people feel they have no say, no dignity, no development, and no connection between effort and meaning, work can start to feel less like contribution and more like endurance. Day after day, this creates a dull but corrosive despair. A person may not say, "I am depressed because my job strips me of agency," yet their mind and body may register exactly that. They may become exhausted, numb, or constantly on edge. Modern societies often treat this as an individual failure to manage stress, but often the problem is more structural. If you place people in conditions of insecurity, surveillance, monotony, and relentless demand, then emotional distress is not some mysterious outcome. It is a predictable one. Mental health cannot be separated from whether people feel useful, respected, and able to influence the shape of their own daily lives. Nature is another neglected part of this conversation. Many people now live in environments dominated by traffic, screens, artificial light, enclosed rooms, and relentless stimulation. We spend days moving from one controlled indoor setting to another, while the natural world becomes something we visit briefly rather than belong to. Yet human beings did not develop under these conditions. Across generations, we evolved in relation to seasons, landscapes, weather, plants, and open space. It should not seem sentimental to say that something in us still responds to that older rhythm. When people are cut off from the natural world for long periods, they are not only missing scenery, they are missing restoration. Nature slows the pace of attention. It offers non-competitive space. It reminds us that not everything is measured by output, speed, or comparison. A walk in a park, time in a garden, or simple contact with living things will not solve every crisis. But these experiences can reintroduce forms of calm that modern life steadily erodes. If a culture leaves people overstimulated, indoor-bound, and chronically hurried, then emotional suffering should be read partly as an environmental signal. The mind is not separate from the world it inhabits. It absorbs that world, often more deeply than we realize. There's also the question of values. Many societies constantly encourage us to look for fulfillment in status, possessions, visibility, and performance. From childhood onward, we absorb the message that a good life is one that looks impressive from the outside. We are urged to achieve, display, compare, and compete. We are invited to measure ourselves by money, image, followers, productivity, and public markers of success. But even when people manage to keep up with these demands, the promised satisfaction often does not arrive. Why? Because human beings need more than admiration or accumulation. We need belonging, purpose, intimacy, usefulness, and a sense that our lives are organized around something that matters. A life centered on display may create stimulation, but not nourishment. It can keep us busy while quietly starving the deeper parts of us. This is one reason modern distress can coexist with material comfort. A person can have conveniences, choices, and social visibility, yet still feel inwardly empty. The problem is not comfort itself. The problem is what happens when a culture repeatedly trains people to seek meaning in places where meaning rarely lasts. Under those conditions, anxiety and depression are not personal oddities. They are warnings that we are pursuing substitutes for what we actually need. If these causes are social and cultural, as well as biological, then the solutions must be broader too. One of the most hopeful ideas is that healing often begins with reconnection. Not just talking about feelings in the abstract, but becoming linked again to people, places, and tasks that create meaning. This can happen in many forms. It may happen when isolated people join a shared activity that matters to them. It may happen when neighbors begin caring for a common space. It may happen through volunteering, cooperative projects, community groups, art, faith communities, or practical work done together. The key point is that recovery is not always something a person can manufacture alone, in private, through willpower. Sometimes what they most need is not another instruction to cope better, but an experience of being held within a wider human structure. When people begin to contribute to something beyond themselves, they often recover not only social contact, but also direction. Their lives stop feeling like sealed rooms. Shared purpose can loosen despair because it interrupts the feeling of isolation and futility that so often sits at the center of depression. The opposite of suffering is not constant happiness. Very often, it is connection, usefulness, and the return of a future that feels worth moving toward. This way of thinking also changes how we understand people who are in pain. Too often, those who are depressed or anxious are made to feel ashamed. They may be told directly or indirectly that they are weak, irrational, dramatic, or incapable. Even where there is sympathy, there can still be a subtle message that they should sort themselves out quietly and return to normal as quickly as possible. But emotional pain is not a moral failure. It is not proof that someone is broken beyond value. In many cases, it is a signal that something important is out of balance in their life, their relationships, or their environment. That signal can be confusing, and sometimes it can become so intense that people cannot interpret it on their own. That is why support matters so much. People need good clinicians, certainly, but they also need friends who listen, families that do not minimize, employers who recognize human limits, and communities that do not abandon the vulnerable. If distress has meaning, then the task is not to shame it into silence. The task is to listen carefully enough to understand what conditions gave rise to it. Compassion is not softness here. It is accuracy. It recognizes that suffering often becomes worse when people are left alone with it and blamed for producing it. At the same time, this perspective gives us a more demanding responsibility. If we accept that rising distress reflects not only individual pathology, but also damaged ways of living, then we cannot be satisfied with narrow fixes. We have to ask harder questions about society itself. What kinds of communities are we building? What kinds of jobs are we normalizing? What values are we teaching children? What technologies are shaping attention, comparison, and self-worth? What does it mean that so many people feel disposable, lonely, or permanently behind? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are mental health questions. A culture that routinely weakens belonging, autonomy, and meaning will generate suffering on a large scale. So the real challenge is not only to comfort individuals once they collapse, but to create conditions in which fewer people are pushed towards collapse in the first place. That means stronger communities, more humane institutions, healthier public spaces, less corrosive competition, and a richer idea of what human flourishing actually is. Mental health should not be treated solely as a private medical issue. It is also social, ethical, and political. It reflects the quality of the worlds we ask people to inhabit every day. So perhaps the most important change is this. Instead of asking only how to silence pain, we should ask what pain is saying. Depression and anxiety can be terrifying, disorienting, and deeply disabling. No one should romanticize them, but neither should we strip them of meaning. In many cases, they're not random intrusions from nowhere. They are signals that something essential is missing or injured. Connection, purpose, dignity, security, rest, belonging, hope. When we hear those signals only as malfunctions, we may relieve symptoms without addressing causes. But when we hear them as meaningful responses to lived conditions, we open the possibility of deeper healing. That healing may involve medicine, therapy, and clinical care. For many people, it should. But it may also require rebuilding parts of life that modern culture has neglected or destroyed. We need a language of mental health that is compassionate, intelligent, and wide enough to hold both biology and biography, both chemistry and community. And above all, we need to stop telling struggling people that their pain is a private defect. Very often, it is a human response to an inhuman way of living. If we listen properly, that pain may guide us not only towards individual recovery, but toward a better society for all of us.